"Say hi to the sharks," my wife whispered as she pushed me off the yacht. Her lover just stood there smiling. Their plan was to steal my $3 billion fortune. But when they returned home, I was sitting there with a special gift. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Bruce. I'm 56 years old, and 3 months ago my wife tried to murder me. I keep telling myself that sentence over and over because even now it doesn't feel real. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of believing Amber loved me, and it all ended with 4 words whispered in my ear as she shoved me off our yacht. "Say hi to the sharks." The water hit me like a concrete wall. 58 degrees, according to the weather report I'd checked that morning when I was still a trusting husband planning a romantic sunset cruise. The Pacific Ocean in September can kill a man in less than an hour, and Amber knew that. She'd studied the weather patterns, the currents, the water temperature. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was calculated murder. I remember the shock of the cold water more than the betrayal itself. My body went into immediate survival mode, every nerve screaming as the icy Pacific closed over my head. The weight of my clothes dragged me down, my leather shoes like anchors, and for a moment I thought this was it. 56 years of life ending because my wife wanted my $3 billion fortune more than she wanted me alive. But something kicked in, something primal. Maybe it was 20 years of early morning swims in our pool, maybe it was pure stubborn rage, but I fought my way to the surface. When I broke through, gasping and choking on salt water, the first thing I saw was our yacht, the Golden Horizon, already 100 yards away and moving fast. Amber stood on the deck next to a man I didn't recognize. Tall, dark hair, expensive clothes. He had his arm around her waist like they'd been lovers for years, not minutes. She was laughing. Actually laughing as she watched me struggle in the water that was supposed to be my grave. The sound carried across the waves, high and bright, like she'd just heard the funniest joke in the world. The man said something to her, and she nodded, pointing in my direction. For a moment I thought they might come back, that maybe this was some sick joke that had gone too far. But then the yacht's engines roared louder, and they disappeared over the horizon, leaving me alone with the sharks Amber had so casually mentioned. The first fin appeared about 10 minutes later. I've never been a religious man, but floating in that endless gray water with a great white circling me like I was Sunday dinner, I found myself bargaining with whatever god might be listening. The shark was massive, at least 12 feet long, its dead black eyes studying me with the patience of a predator that knew wounded prey couldn't swim. Forever. My Rolex, a gift from my father before he died, showed 6:47 p.m. Sunset was in less than 2 hours. If the shark didn't kill me, the cold would. If the cold didn't kill me, the darkness would bring more sharks. I was 3 miles from the nearest shore with no life jacket, no emergency beacon, and a wife who was probably already calling my lawyer to ask about my will. The shark struck just as I was starting to feel hypothermia set in. Not a killing bite, just a test, its sandpaper skin scraping along my left shoulder as it swept past. The pain was immediate and shocking, like being dragged across broken glass, and my blood in the water turned the sea around me pink. That's when I got angry. Really, truly angry for the first time in my life. 20 years I'd given that woman everything. I'd built my tech company from nothing, working 18-hour days, missing family dinners and vacations, all so she could live like a queen. $15 million mansion in Malibu, $200,000 a month in spending money, jewelry worth more than most people's houses. I'd trusted her with my heart, my fortune, my life. And this was how she repaid me, fed to sharks like garbage while she sailed away with her lover. The anger gave me strength I didn't know I had. When the shark came back for a second pass, I grabbed a piece of floating debris from the yacht's wake, probably part of the deck furniture, and slammed it into the creature's snout. It veered away, confused by prey that fought back, and I used those precious seconds to start swimming. I don't remember much of the next 4 hours. Cold darkness, pain from the gash on my shoulder, and the constant terror of something massive rising from the depths to finish what my wife had started. My leather shoes had long since been kicked off, my wallet and phone lost to the Pacific. Everything that identified me as Bruce Morrison, tech billionaire, was gone. I was just meat in the water, fighting to stay alive one stroke at a time. The rocks appeared like a miracle, just as my strength was giving out. Sharp, black volcanic stones jutting up from the ocean floor, part of a small, uninhabited island I'd seen on nautical charts, but never bothered to visit. The waves threw me against them with enough force to crack ribs, but I held on with fingers that had long since lost all feeling. Hauling myself out of that water was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Every muscle screamed, my shoulder bled freely, and my core body temperature was low enough that I was shaking so violently I could barely grip the rocks. But I was alive. Amber's perfect murder had failed by a matter of minutes and a few hundred yards of Pacific current. I collapsed on a narrow strip of rocky beach, lungs burning as I coughed up what felt like gallons of seawater. My throat was raw from salt water and screaming, my hands cut to ribbons from the rocks, and the shark bite on my shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the waves that had almost become my grave, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt free. For the first time in 2 decades, I wasn't thinking about stock prices or board meetings or Amber's latest shopping trip. I was thinking about survival, about the pure animal satisfaction of cheating death through strength and will. Amber thought she'd killed the weak, trusting husband who'd given her everything she wanted. She had no idea she'd just created her worst nightmare. I spent that first night shivering on the rocks, using strips torn from my shirt to bandage the shark bite as best I could. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow could be Amber and her lover returning to make sure the job was finished. But as dawn broke over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, I realized something that would have made Amber sick with rage if she'd known. I was going to live. I was going to survive this. And when I was ready, when I was strong enough, I was going to find out exactly who my wife really was and what she'd done to deserve 20 years of my trust. The rescue boat appeared on the second day, drawn by the smoke from my signal fire. As the Coast Guard pulled me from those rocks, hypothermic and delirious but alive, I made them a promise I intended to keep. I told them my name was David Chen, a tourist who'd fallen from a fishing boat. Bruce Morrison, loving husband and trusting fool, was dead. The man Amber had tried to murder was someone else entirely, and he was coming home. The television in my hospital room was playing my own funeral. I stared at the screen in disbelief, watching my wife of 20 years dab at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, while the pastor spoke about my tragic accident at sea. Amber wore black Chanel, the same dress she'd worn to her mother's funeral 3 years ago. She'd always been practical about recycling expensive clothes. Such a loving husband, the pastor was saying. Bruce Morrison lived for his family, worked tirelessly to provide for those he cherished most. The camera panned across the crowd. 500 people, maybe more. Business associates, employees from Morrison Tech, neighbors from Malibu, all of them mourning a man who was very much alive, watching his own memorial service from a hospital bed in San Pedro, while nurses fussed over his shark bite and hypothermia. I'd been in the hospital for 5 days, under the name David Chen. The Coast Guard rescue had been routine enough that nobody questioned the story of a tourist falling overboard. I'd told them I was visiting from Hong Kong, spoke just enough broken English to seem believable, and paid cash for everything. The real David Chen was a business contact in Shanghai who wouldn't mind if I borrowed his identity for a few weeks. What I hadn't expected was watching Amber bury me with such convincing grief. She stepped up to the podium, and I felt my chest tighten despite everything I knew about her now. Even after she'd tried to murder me, seeing her cry over my casket did something to my heart that I hated myself for feeling. "Bruce was my everything," she said, her voice breaking in exactly the right places. 20 years wasn't long enough. I would have given anything for 20 more. The crowd murmured sympathetically. Several women in the front row were openly weeping. Amber's performance was flawless, the grieving widow who'd lost the love of her life to a cruel accident. If I hadn't lived through her pushing me off that yacht, I might have believed it myself. But then the camera caught something the mourners couldn't see. As Amber stepped down from the podium, she glanced toward the back of the church and gave the slightest nod to someone off camera. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it was enough. My loving widow was giving signals to her accomplice at my own funeral. I grabbed my phone and called my lawyer. "Morrison and Associates, this is Jennifer." "Jennifer, it's David Chen. I need to speak with Richard Morrison immediately." Richard Morrison, my younger brother and business partner, had been handling my affairs since the Coast Guard declared me missing, presumed dead. He was also the only person who knew about my emergency protocols, including the David Chen identity I'd set up years ago for exactly this kind of situation. When you're worth $3 billion, you learn to plan for betrayal. "David, thank God!" Richard's voice was tight with stress. "I've been trying to reach you for days. Where the hell are you?" "San Pedro General Hospital, room 214. Can you get here without being seen?" "Jesus Christ, Bruce. Amber's been calling me every hour asking about the will. She's already hired her own legal team, some shark named Patterson from Beverly Hills. I think she's planning to move fast on the estate." I felt my jaw clench. "How fast?" "She filed preliminary paperwork yesterday. Apparently there's some clause about presumed death in international waters that speeds up the process. Bruce, she could have access to the joint accounts within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. The woman who'd tried to feed me to sharks would have $50 million to play with in 2 weeks. Richard, I need you to listen very carefully. Don't file anything, don't sign anything, and don't let Amber near the company accounts. Tell her you're waiting for the official death certificate. What's really going on? The Coast Guard said there was no evidence of foul play." I closed my eyes, thinking about Amber's laugh as she watched me drowning. "There wasn't supposed to be any evidence. Can you get here tonight? And bring a digital recorder. I have a story to tell you that's going to make you sick." Richard arrived after visiting hours, slipping past the nurses with the confidence of a man who'd bribed his way out of more complicated situations. My brother was 52, 4 years younger than me, with the same dark hair and stubborn jaw that had made us both successful in business. But where I'd trusted too easily, Richard had always been suspicious of people's motives. One look at my face, and he knew this wasn't an accident. "Who did this to you?" His voice was deadly quiet as he took in the bandages, the bruises, the way I winced when I moved my left shoulder. "My wife." The words tasted like poison. 20 years, Richard. 20 years of marriage, and she tried to murder me for the money. I told him everything. The romantic sunset cruise that turned into an execution attempt, the man on the yacht I'd never seen before, the way Amber had laughed as the shark circled me. Richard's face went through a dozen different expressions, from disbelief to rage to something that looked like murder. "We go to the police," he said when I finished. "Tonight we end this right now." "With what evidence?" "It's my word against hers, and I'm supposed to be dead. Besides, I want to know how deep this goes. Who's the man she was with? How long have they been planning this? What else has she been doing behind my back?" Richard pulled out his laptop and showed me something that made my stomach drop. "Bank records. She's been transferring money to offshore accounts for 6 months. $5 million so far, all from the household expense account." $5 million. I thought about all the times Amber had complained about money being tight, how she'd needed to cut back on shopping, how we couldn't afford to renovate the guest house, all while she was stealing millions to fund her escape plan. "There's more," Richard said, scrolling through financial records. "She took out 3 life insurance policies on you in the past year. 10 million, 15 million, and 25 million. Total payout would be $50 million if you died in an accident." The room felt like it was spinning. 50 million in life insurance, plus access to our joint accounts, plus her inheritance from my will. Amber stood to collect nearly $200 million from my death. No wonder she'd been planning this for months. "Richard, I need you to do something for me, and you're not going to like it." He looked up from the laptop. "What?" "I need you to let her have the joint accounts. Don't fight it, don't delay it, just let her take the money." "Are you insane? That's $50 million. I leaned forward despite the pain in my ribs. "It's bait? I want to see what she does when she thinks she's gotten away with murder. Where does she go? Who does she meet? How many people are involved in this?" Richard shook his head. "Bruce, you almost died. This woman tried to kill you and you want to give her $50 million to see what happens next? She's going to take it anyway. This way I control how she gets it. And while she's spending my money and celebrating my death, I'm going to find out exactly who my wife really is. I pulled up the news coverage of my funeral on my phone. Look at this. 300 business associates, a $5,000 casket, flowers from every high society family in California. She threw me the funeral of the year, Richard. Why? Because she's establishing her grief for the insurance companies? Partly, but look at the guest list. Look at who came to mourn the man she murdered. I scrolled through the photos, pointing out faces I recognized. There's Morrison Tech's entire board of directors. There's the mayor of Malibu. There's Senator Patterson's wife. She's not just establishing grief, she's establishing connections. Richard was quiet for a long moment, studying the photos. You think she's planning to stay in California, take over your social position? I think she's planning something bigger than just stealing my money, and I'm going to find out what. I made Richard promise not to tell anyone I was alive, not even his wife or his kids. As far as the world knew, Bruce Morrison was fish food in the Pacific Ocean. The man in the hospital bed was David Chen, a foreign tourist who'd been lucky enough to survive a boating accident. But David Chen had access to Bruce Morrison's offshore accounts, the ones Amber didn't know about. David Chen had 20 years of business contacts who owed Bruce Morrison favors, and most importantly, David Chen had nothing left to lose and all the time in the world to plan his revenge. After Richard left, I lay in the dark thinking about the man I'd seen on the yacht. Tall, dark-haired, expensive clothes, comfortable enough with Amber to put his arm around her while they watched me drown. He wasn't just her lover, he was her partner in this, maybe even the one who'd planned it. I thought about the timing of the insurance policies, the offshore transfers, the way Amber had known exactly when the water would be coldest and the sharks most active. This wasn't the work of a desperate housewife who decided to kill her husband for money. This was professional. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. For a moment my blood ran cold, thinking somehow Amber had found me. But when I opened it, the message was even worse than I'd feared. Saw the news about the tech billionaire. Shame about the sharks. My condolences to his lovely widow. D, the man on the yacht. Somehow he knew I was alive. The text message from D changed everything. I stared at those words for an hour after Richard left, my hands shaking not from hypothermia this time, but from the realization that whoever had helped Amber try to kill me knew I was alive. Worse, he was taunting me about it. Saw the news about the tech billionaire. Shame about the sharks. My condolences to his lovely widow. D. This wasn't some crime of passion or a desperate housewife's scheme. This was professional, and I was dealing with someone who'd done this before. I discharged myself from the hospital the next morning against doctor's orders. The shark bite on my shoulder was healing, the hypothermia was gone, and David Chen needed to disappear before D decided to finish what he'd started on that yacht. I paid my bill in cash, walked out the front door, and vanished into the sprawl of Los Angeles like a man who'd never existed. My first stop was a 24-hour internet cafe in Koreatown where nobody asked questions and everything was paid for in cash. I set up secure email accounts, encrypted messaging apps, and started searching for any trace of the man who'd been on my yacht that night. The problem was, I only had fragments. Tall, dark hair, expensive clothes, comfortable enough with violence to watch a murder without flinching. And that single initial, D, I started with Amber. 20 years of marriage, and I realized I knew almost nothing about my wife's life before she met me. She'd told me she was from Phoenix, that her parents were dead, that she'd worked as a marketing consultant before we married. I'd never questioned any of it because I'd been too busy building my company and too in love to care about her past. Now, sitting in that internet cafe at 3 in the morning, I discovered that Amber Hartwell Morrison had never existed. There was no birth certificate for an Amber Hartwell born in Phoenix in 1982, no death certificates for her supposed parents, no record of her attending Arizona State University, as she'd claimed. The woman I'd married was a ghost, and she'd been lying to me since the day we met. But ghosts leave traces if you know where to look. I found her in a Las Vegas newspaper archive from 2001, a small item in the society pages about a charity auction featuring a photograph of wealthy donors. There she was, 23 years old and stunning, standing next to a silver-haired man identified as real estate mogul Harold Prescott and companion. Harold Prescott had died 6 months later in a boating accident off the California coast. My blood went cold as I read the details. Prescott, 71, had been sailing alone when his yacht capsized in rough weather. His body was never recovered, but his much younger girlfriend inherited everything through a will that had been updated just weeks before his death. The girlfriend's name was Ashley Reed. Ashley Reed looked exactly like Amber Hartwell. I spent the next 4 hours in that cafe, following a trail that made me sick to my stomach. Ashley Reed had disappeared after Prescott's death, only to resurface 2 years later as Miranda Stone, engaged to a Texas oil executive named William Patterson. Patterson died in a car accident 3 months after their wedding, leaving his new bride $25 million and a drilling operation worth twice that. Miranda Stone vanished. 6 months later, Amber Hartwell appeared in my life. But it was the fourth identity that made my hands shake as I read. Before Ashley Reed, before the real estate mogul, and the oil executive, there had been a woman named Diana Cross. She'd been married to a tech entrepreneur in Seattle, a man named Robert Chen, who'd built a software company worth $40 million. Robert Chen had died in a sailing accident in 2001, lost at sea, body never recovered, survived by his loving wife who inherited everything. The pattern was clear and it was horrifying. The woman I'd married wasn't just a murderer, she was a serial killer who specialized in wealthy husbands and boating accidents. I was victim number 4 that I could find, and there might be others I hadn't discovered yet. But she wasn't working alone. The man on the yacht, D, he had to be her partner, maybe her handler, someone who helped her target victims, forge identities, and disappear after each murder. I found him in a photograph from William Patterson's funeral in Dallas. He was standing in the background, just another mourner paying respects to the grieving widow. But I recognized the tall frame, the dark hair, the expensive clothes. Most importantly, I recognized the way he was looking at Miranda Stone with the satisfaction of a job well done. A reverse image search led me to a corporate website for something called Meridian Investments, where the same man was listed as Derek Castellanos, senior partner. The biography was vague but impressive. Harvard MBA, extensive experience in mergers and acquisitions, specialized in helping wealthy individuals manage complex financial transitions. Derek Castellanos, Derek, D. I looked up everything I could find about Meridian Investments and felt my stomach drop. It wasn't a real investment firm. It was a front, a way for Derek to meet wealthy targets and gain their trust. The office address was a mail drop in Beverly Hills. The phone number went to a service that took messages. Even the testimonials on the website were fake, written by people who didn't exist. Derek Castellanos was as much of a ghost as Amber Hartwell, but he was better at hiding his tracks. I spent 3 more days in that internet cafe, living on vending machine coffee and energy bars, following a trail of breadcrumbs that led back decades. Derek and Amber, or whatever their real names were, had been working together for at least 15 years. They'd killed at least 6 people that I could document, maybe more. They were professionals and they were very good at what they did. But they'd made one mistake. They'd assumed I was dead. I rented a studio apartment in East LA under a different false name, paid 3 months in advance in cash, and set up a war room. Printed photographs covered every wall. Harold Prescott, William Patterson, Robert Chen, and 3 other men I'd connected to mysterious deaths and grieving widows who looked suspiciously like my wife. Financial records, newspaper clippings, property transfers, insurance payouts. The total was staggering. Over 20 years, Derek and Amber had stolen more than $300 million from their victims. They'd perfected a system. Derek would identify targets, wealthy older men with substantial assets and few family connections. Amber would seduce them, marry them quickly, and update their wills. Then Derek would arrange an accident, usually involving boats or cars, something that could plausibly be explained as bad luck. After each death, Amber would mourn publicly for exactly 1 year before disappearing with a new identity. Derek would fade into the background until they were ready to hunt again. It was methodical, patient, and absolutely ruthless. But something was different this time. I spread out photos of all the victims on my table and noticed a pattern. Harold Prescott, 71, William Patterson, 68, Robert Chen, 63. The others ranged from 60 to 75 years old, men who were past their physical prime, easy to overpower if necessary. I was 56. Still strong, still swimming regularly, still young enough to put up a fight. Why had they targeted me? The answer came to me as I studied a photograph of Amber at Patterson's funeral. She was 39 then, getting older, losing the fresh-faced beauty that had made her such an effective honey trap. At 42, she was running out of time to play the grieving young widow. She needed one more score, big enough to retire on. My $3 billion wasn't just another heist, it was her pension plan, but there was something else, something that made my blood run cold as I connected the final pieces. In every previous case, Amber had disappeared completely after her year of mourning, new identity, new city, new life. This time, she wasn't planning to disappear. This time, she was planning to stay. To remain Amber Morrison, beloved widow of the tech billionaire, pillar of Malibu society. She'd bought herself a permanent identity with my death, which meant she thought she'd covered all the loose ends. She thought I was dead. Derek thought I was dead. And anyone else who might have known the truth was already 6 feet under. They had no idea they were dealing with a ghost who was very much alive and very, very angry. My phone buzzed with another text message. Same number as before, same taunting tone. Hope you're enjoying your new life, David. Amazing what modern medicine can do for shark bite victims. Give my regards to your brother. D. He knew about Richard. He knew I was using the David Chen identity. Somehow Derek had found me. But as I read that message, I realized something that made me smile for the first time since I'd been pushed off that yacht. Derek was making threats, but he wasn't acting on them. He wasn't coming for me directly, wasn't sending hired killers to finish the job. That meant he was scared. Maybe he thought I had evidence hidden somewhere, insurance against exactly this kind of betrayal. Maybe he thought killing me twice would draw too much attention. Or maybe, just maybe, he was starting to realize that murdering Bruce Morrison had been a mistake. Because Bruce Morrison had been a trusting fool who'd given his wife everything she wanted and never questioned her motives. But the man Derek was threatening now was someone else entirely. Someone who'd clawed his way back from death, who'd spent 20 years building a business empire from nothing, who had resources Derek couldn't even imagine. Someone who knew exactly who they were and what they'd done. Someone who was coming for them both. I sent Derek a message back, just 4 words that would let him know the game had changed. See you soon, B. Then I turned off the phone, smashed it with a hammer, and threw the pieces in 3 different dumpsters. David Chen was dead now, too, but Bruce Morrison was very much alive, and he was ready to go to war. I spent 2 weeks watching my own house. From a rented car parked on Mulholland Drive, I had a perfect view of the Morrison estate in Malibu. $15 million of oceanfront property, complete with infinity pool, private beach access, and enough security cameras to make Fort Knox jealous. I'd installed those cameras myself 3 years ago when Amber complained about feeling unsafe with all the break-ins in the neighborhood. Now I was grateful for my own paranoia. Every camera fed to a secure server I controlled, which meant I could watch Derek and Amber's every move from the comfort of my surveillance nest. What I saw made me realize I'd underestimated how dangerous this situation really was. Derek had moved into my house, not as a guest, but as the man of the house. He answered the door when delivery trucks arrived, he took calls in my study, and worst of all, he was going through my files with the methodical precision of someone inventory a conquered territory. But it was Amber's behavior that told me the real story. She wasn't acting like a woman celebrating her successful murder. She was acting like a woman who was terrified. I watched her through the telephoto lens as she paced the living room, constantly checking her phone, jumping every time Derek entered the room. When she thought he wasn't looking, her face showed something I'd never seen before. Pure fear. Derek, meanwhile, was making himself comfortable with the casual arrogance of a man who'd won. He wore my clothes, slept in my bed, and treated my staff like they belonged to him. But more importantly, he was making changes to the house. Security upgrades, new locks, camera modifications. He was fortifying the place like he expected trouble. The breakthrough came on day 14 of my surveillance. I watched Derek leave the house alone, driving my Porsche like he owned it. For 3 hours, Amber was alone in that mansion with just the housekeeper and gardener. That's when I saw her make a phone call from the guest bedroom, the one room in the house that didn't have security cameras. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could read her body language, desperate gestures, tears, the posture of someone begging for help. When she hung up, she sat on the bed for 20 minutes, just staring at her hands like she was trying to solve an impossible puzzle. That night, I broke into Derek's real office, not the fake address for Meridian Investments, but a legitimate office suite in Century City that was registered under another shell company. Getting inside required skills I'd learned in my early tech days when I'd been more hacker than businessman. Electronic locks were just computers, and computers could always be convinced to do what you wanted if you knew the right language. What I found in Derek's files made me physically sick. He kept trophies, photographs of all his victims taken moments before they died. Harold Prescott, terrified and begging as Derek prepared to sabotage his yacht. William Patterson, drugged and unconscious in the front seat before his car was pushed off that cliff. Robert Chen, the tech entrepreneur who looked so much like me, beaten unconscious before being thrown overboard. But it was the file labeled Morrison Project that made my hands shake as I read. Derek hadn't just been planning to kill me for my money. He'd been planning to kill Amber, too. According to his notes, Amber had outlived her usefulness. At 42, she was too old to effectively seduce new targets, and her repeated identity changes were becoming harder to maintain in the digital age. Worse, she was showing signs of what Derek called emotional instability, forming genuine attachments to some of their victims. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Derek would help Amber kill me and collect the inheritance. They'd lay low for 6 months, enjoying the $3 billion fortune. Then Derek would arrange for Amber to have an accident, probably a home invasion gone wrong or a car crash on the Pacific Coast Highway. With both spouses dead, Derek would inherit everything through a complex web of shell companies and forged documents. Amber thought she was killing me to secure her future. In reality, she was signing her own death warrant. I photographed every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence that Derek had carefully collected over 20 years of murder. Then I copied everything to encrypted drives and uploaded backups to secure servers around the world. When this was over, Derek would have nowhere to hide. But first I had to decide what to do about Amber. She'd tried to kill me. She'd laughed as sharks circled my bleeding body. She'd spent 20 years lying to my face, stealing my money and planning my death. Every rational part of my brain said she deserved whatever Derek had planned for her. But another part of me, a part I hated to acknowledge, remembered the woman who'd cried at her mother's funeral, the woman who'd held my hand during my father's last days in the hospital, the woman who'd seemed genuinely happy during our early years together before the money and the luxury and whatever demon Derek had put in her head. Maybe she'd been faking all of it. Maybe every moment of apparent love had been calculated manipulation, but maybe, just maybe, there'd been something real buried under all the lies. Either way, I couldn't let Derek murder her. Not because I loved her anymore, but because I refused to let that monster win. I started planning my return from the dead. The timing had to be perfect. Derek was clearly paranoid about loose ends, which meant he'd move against Amber soon. Based on his notes, he was waiting for the life insurance payouts to clear, probably another 2 to 3 weeks. Once he had access to the $50 million in policies, plus the inheritance money, Amber would become expendable. I needed evidence that would convince the authorities, a plan that would expose both of them, and most importantly, a way to stay alive long enough to see justice done. The evidence was already handled. 20 years of Derek's carefully documented murders, plus financial records showing the pattern of inheritance theft, plus my own testimony about the yacht incident. That was enough to put him away forever. The plan was more complex. I couldn't just walk into a police station and announce I was alive. Derek had too many resources, too many escape routes. He'd disappear the moment he knew I was coming, and Amber would die before any investigation could protect her. Instead, I needed to draw him out, make him commit to a course of action he couldn't back away from. I needed him to try to kill me again in front of witnesses who could testify to his guilt. I needed to throw my own funeral. The invitation went out 3 weeks after my death, sent from Richard's law firm to a select group of business associates and family friends. A celebration of Bruce Morrison's life and legacy to be held at the Morrison estate. Amber would host naturally as the grieving widow. Derek would attend as her emotional support. What they didn't know was that the guest list included 2 undercover FBI agents, a federal prosecutor who owed me favors from a cybercrime case I'd helped solve, and a documentary filmmaker who'd be recording everything for what he thought was a memorial video. I spent the remaining weeks preparing for the performance of my lifetime, new identity documents, disguises, and, most importantly, a way to get close to Derek without him recognizing me until it was too late. The plan was insane, dangerous, and probably illegal. But it was also the only way to save Amber's life and expose Derek's crimes before he disappeared forever. On the morning of my own memorial service, I stood in my hotel bathroom, staring at my reflection as I prepared to become someone else one more time. The shark bite scar was still visible on my shoulder, a permanent reminder of the night my wife tried to feed me to the ocean. But scars weren't always signs of weakness. Sometimes they were proof that you'd survived something that should have killed you. Derek had made one crucial mistake when he'd pushed me off that yacht. He'd assumed that a wealthy, comfortable man would give up when faced with death. He'd never considered that some people get stronger when they're stripped of everything they thought they needed. I wasn't the same trusting fool who'd gone on that romantic sunset cruise 6 weeks ago. That man was dead, killed by betrayal and reborn in salt water and blood. The man getting ready to attend his own funeral was someone Derek had never met. Someone who'd learned that love could be a lie, that family could be a weapon, and that the only person you could truly trust was yourself. Someone who was about to remind Derek Castellanos why you should never try to murder a man who has nothing left to lose. As I adjusted my disguise one final time, I thought about the conversation I'd overheard between Derek and Amber 3 days ago, picked up by the listening device I'd planted in my own study. Derek had been explaining his plans for after the insurance money cleared. A trip to Europe, he'd said, just the 2 of them. A romantic getaway to celebrate their new life together. Amber had agreed enthusiastically, but I'd caught the tremor in her voice, the fear she was trying so hard to hide. She knew what Derek was really planning. She knew that trip to Europe was going to be one way for only one of them. In 6 hours, I'd walk into my own memorial service. Derek would see a stranger in the crowd, another mourner paying respects to the man he'd murdered. Amber would play the grieving widow one more time, not knowing she was performing for her own killer. And somewhere in the middle of that perfectly orchestrated lie, Bruce Morrison would rise from the dead to settle accounts with the people who'd tried to bury him. The sharks hadn't finished me. The ocean hadn't claimed me. And Derek Castellanos was about to learn why some ghosts don't stay buried. I walked into my own memorial service wearing the face of a stranger. The makeup artist I'd hired had done incredible work. Prosthetic cheekbones, colored contact lenses, a carefully styled beard, and enough subtle changes to alter my bone structure without looking obviously fake. To anyone who didn't know me intimately, I was just another mourner paying respects to the late Bruce Morrison. The estate looked exactly as I'd imagined it would for my funeral. White roses everywhere, the smell of expensive catering, and 200 people dressed in black wandering through rooms where I'd lived for 20 years. My living room had been converted into a shrine, complete with enlarged photographs of my life and a guest book that people were signing with appropriately somber expressions. What struck me most was how normal it all felt. business associates discussing stock prices over cocktails, neighbors gossiping about property values, everyone performing the social ritual of mourning while secretly calculating how my death might benefit them. Even my own funeral was just another networking event in disguise. But then I saw Amber, and my chest tightened despite everything I knew about her. She stood by the fireplace in a black silk dress I'd never seen before, accepting condolences with the perfect balance of grief and grace. Her performance was flawless, the devastated widow holding herself together through sheer force of will. Every gesture, every tear, every brave smile was calculated to maximum emotional impact. If I hadn't lived through her pushing me off that yacht, I would have believed every second of it. Derek stood beside her, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder, playing the role of the supportive friend helping her through this difficult time. He wore one of my suits, I realized with a surge of anger. My charcoal gray Armani, tailored specifically for my build but fitting him well enough that most people wouldn't notice. The sight of him wearing my clothes while comforting my would-be widow at my own funeral was almost enough to make me blow my cover right there. But I forced myself to stay calm, to remember why I was here. Scattered throughout the crowd were the people who would make this work. Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, disguised as a representative from a tech industry magazine. Federal Prosecutor James Chen, posing as a business associate from Silicon Valley. Documentary filmmaker Rebecca Walsh, openly filming what everyone thought was a memorial video. They were recording everything, waiting for my signal to move. I accepted a glass of wine from a passing waiter and mingled with the crowd, listening to conversations about my life and legacy. It was surreal hearing people discuss my character, my achievements, my supposed virtues when half of them had been trying to poach my clients or steal my employees while I was alive. But it was the conversation I overheard between Derek and Amber that made my blood run cold. The insurance adjuster called this morning, Derek was saying, his voice low enough that only someone with my trained hearing could pick it up. Everything clears next week. $50 million, free and clear. Amber nodded, but her smile looked strained. And after that? After that, we celebrate. I've booked us that trip to Monaco we discussed. First-class flights, presidential suite at the Hotel Hermitage. We'll toast Bruce's memory in style. Monaco. According to Derek's files, that's where two of his previous partners had died in convenient accidents. Amber didn't know it yet, but she was agreeing to her own execution. I moved closer, pretending to examine one of the photo displays while I listened to their conversation. Derek? Amber's voice was barely a whisper. What if someone finds out? What if they investigate? Derek's laugh was soft and confident. Who's going to investigate? Bruce fell off a yacht and drowned. Tragic accident happens all the time. The Coast Guard closed the case, the insurance companies are paying out, and in 6 months everyone will have forgotten this ever happened. But what if he... Amber stopped herself, glancing around nervously. What if he what? Derek's voice sharpened slightly. What if he survived? Amber, I watched him go into that water. I saw the shark circle him. Nobody survives that. I felt a grim satisfaction as I watched Amber's face pale. She was starting to understand that Derek wasn't the careful, methodical partner she'd thought he was. He was a psychopath who enjoyed killing, and she was beginning to realize she might be next. But Derek wasn't finished. Besides, even if by some miracle he did survive, what's he going to do? Tell everyone his wife tried to murder him? He has no proof, no witnesses, nothing but a story that makes him sound like a paranoid lunatic. The man is legally dead, Amber. Dead men don't file police reports. That was my cue. I set down my wine glass and walked directly toward them, my heart hammering against my ribs. 20 feet away, Derek was still talking, oblivious to the fact that the dead man he was discussing was approaching from behind. 15 feet. Amber looked up and her eyes swept past me without recognition. The disguise was holding. 10 feet. Derek turned slightly, and for a moment I thought he might recognize something familiar in my posture or my walk, but his gaze passed over me like I was just another mourner. 5 feet. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I stopped directly behind Derek, close enough to touch his shoulder. Then I spoke, using my normal voice for the first time in 7 weeks. "Hello, Derek. Enjoying my funeral?" The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Derek spun around, his face going white as he stared at what he thought was a ghost. His mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air, no sound coming out. The wine glass in his hand slipped and shattered on the marble floor, red liquid spreading like blood. Amber's reaction was even more dramatic. She let out a strangled gasp and stumbled backward, her hand flying to her throat. For a moment I thought she might faint, but then her survival instincts kicked in and she began looking frantically around the room for escape routes. "You're dead," Derek finally managed to whisper. "You're supposed to be dead." I smiled, the same cold expression I'd learned during those nights floating in the Pacific. "Sorry to disappoint you, but as you can see, reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." The conversations around us had stopped. People were beginning to notice the commotion, though they couldn't yet understand what was happening. They saw a stranger confronting the grieving widow and her friend, but they didn't yet realize they were witnessing a resurrection. Derek's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, and I caught the flash of metal. Gun. I'd expected this, but it still sent adrenaline surging through my system. "I wouldn't," I said calmly. "You're surrounded by witnesses, including several federal agents. Agent Martinez is standing by the piano. Agent Chen is near the bar, and Prosecutor Walsh has been filming this entire conversation." Derek's eyes darted around the room, finally understanding the trap I'd set. His face went from white to red as rage replaced shock. "You bastard," he snarled. "Do you have any idea what you've done? What this will cost?" "I know exactly what it will cost," I replied. "It will cost you your freedom, your money, and your life. But more importantly, it will cost you something you value more than any of those things, your sense of control." Amber found her voice finally. "Bruce, I can explain—" "No!" I cut her off, my voice sharp enough to make her flinch. "You can't explain. There is no explanation for 20 years of lies, no explanation for theft, for murder, for pushing your husband into shark-infested water and laughing while he fought for his life." The room had gone completely silent now. 200 people frozen in place as they watched the impossible scene unfolding before them, the dead man confronting his killers at his own funeral. Agent Martinez was already moving through the crowd, her hand resting casually on her weapon. Agent Chen had positioned himself to block the main exit. Rebecca Walsh kept filming, capturing every moment of Derek and Amber's exposure. Derek made his move. He lunged toward me with the knife I'd seen him palm from the catering table, aiming for my heart with the same cold efficiency he'd used on his other victims. But Derek had made a crucial mistake. He was fighting a man who'd already died once and had nothing left to fear. I caught his wrist and twisted, using leverage techniques I'd learned in 20 years of swimming to redirect his momentum. Derek's own force sent him crashing into the photo display, scattering pictures of my life across the marble floor. The knife skittered away as Derek tried to scramble to his feet, but Agent Martinez was already there with handcuffs. "Derek Castellanos, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and about 20 other charges we'll discuss downtown." As the cuffs clicked shut, Derek looked at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he said. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." I leaned close enough that only he could hear my reply. "Actually, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A coward who preys on people's trust, who's never faced a victim who fought back. But here's what you don't understand, Derek. I'm not a victim anymore. I'm your worst nightmare." Amber had collapsed into one of the chairs, her perfect composure finally cracking. She looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Fear, certainly. Regret, maybe. But also something that might have been relief. "The Monaco trip is canceled," I told her as Agent Chen approached with a second pair of handcuffs. "But don't worry. The federal government provides excellent accommodations, 3 meals a day, medical care, and all the time you need to think about what you've done." As they led Amber away, she turned back to look at me one last time. "Bruce," she said, her voice breaking, "I'm sorry." I wanted to feel something, anger, satisfaction, maybe even pity. But all I felt was empty. The woman I'd loved for 20 years had never existed. She'd been a character in a play, performed by an actress who'd gotten so deep into her role that maybe she'd forgotten who she really was. "So am I," I replied, and I meant it. The memorial service ended with my guests filing police reports instead of signing condolence cards. The catering staff found themselves serving coffee to FBI agents instead of mourners. My resurrection had turned what should have been a celebration of my life into the exposure of crimes spanning 2 decades. As the last of the guests were escorted out for questioning, I stood alone in my living room, surrounded by the wreckage of my former life. Broken wine glasses, scattered photographs, police tape, and the ghost of 20 years' worth of lies. Richard appeared beside me, his face still shell-shocked from everything he'd witnessed. "What now?" he asked. I looked around the room one more time, then headed for the door. Now I start living. 6 months after my resurrection, I was sitting on a beach in the Bahamas, watching the sunrise paint the Caribbean in shades of gold and pink. The island was small, uninhabited except for me and the caretakers who came by boat twice a week with supplies. 12 acres of white sand and palm trees, purchased through a shell company that couldn't be traced back to Bruce Morrison. As far as the world knew, I was still in Los Angeles, still running Morrison Tech, still living in that mansion in Malibu that held too many ghosts. But the real Bruce Morrison had died the night Amber pushed him off that yacht. The man who'd survived was someone else entirely, someone who understood that wealth without trust was worthless, that love without honesty was poison, and that sometimes the only way to truly live was to walk away from everything you thought you needed. The trials had been everything I'd hoped for and more. Derek Castellanos was serving 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The evidence I'd gathered, combined with testimony from the families of his other victims, had painted a picture of a serial killer whose sophistication had allowed him to operate for decades. The judge had called him a predator of the worst kind, who weaponized trust and intimacy to destroy lives. Derek had tried to cut a deal, offering information about other crimes in exchange for a reduced sentence, but there was no deal generous enough to buy his freedom. 23 murders across 15 states, stolen assets worth more than $500 million, and a trail of destroyed families that stretched back to the 1990s. He would die in prison, and I slept better knowing that. Amber's case had been more complex. Her lawyers had argued that she was as much a victim as anyone else, manipulated and controlled by Derek from the time she was barely out of her teens. There was some truth to that. The real Amber, the woman beneath all the false identities, had been a runaway from Phoenix whose drug-addicted mother had sold her to Derek when she was 19 years old. Derek had trained her, shaped her, turned her into the perfect weapon for his schemes. For 23 years, she'd lived without a real identity, without genuine relationships, without anything but the role he'd created for her to play. But she'd also pushed me off that yacht. She'd laughed as sharks circled me. She'd spent 20 years lying to my face while planning my murder. The jury had struggled with her case for 3 weeks before reaching a verdict. Guilty on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and accessory to multiple felonies. 25 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. She would be 57 when she got out if she lived that long. Old enough to understand what she'd lost, young enough to maybe build something real with whatever years she had left. I'd testified at both trials, of course, faced them both in court and told my story to a jury of 12 strangers who'd looked at me like I was a man returned from the dead, which in many ways I was. The prosecution had been thorough, professional, focused on justice rather than revenge. But the defense attorneys had been brutal in their cross-examinations, trying to paint me as a bitter husband seeking retribution rather than a victim seeking justice. "Mr. Morrison," Derek's lawyer had said during his closing argument, "isn't it true that you've orchestrated this entire elaborate scheme because you can't accept that your wife stopped loving you?" I'd looked at Derek as I answered, watching his face as I spoke words that I knew would haunt him in his cell. "Counselor, love was never part of this equation. This was about money, manipulation, and murder. Your client didn't break my heart. He made the mistake of trying to break my will. Derek had stared at me with those cold, dead eyes, and I'd stared right back. No fear, no anger, just the calm certainty of a man who'd already died once and discovered that death wasn't the worst thing that could happen to you. The worst thing was living a lie. After the trials, I'd done what everyone expected. I'd returned to Morrison Tech, thrown myself back into business, tried to rebuild the life that Derek and Amber had shattered. For 3 months, I'd played the part of the grateful survivor, the man who'd cheated death and wanted nothing more than to return to normal. But normal felt like another prison. Every boardroom meeting reminded me of Derek wearing my suits. Every social function brought back memories of Amber charming my friends while planning my death. Every night in that Malibu mansion, I'd wake up thinking I could hear her laugh echoing from the room where she'd probably been planning to kill me. So I'd done something that shocked everyone who knew me, including myself. I'd walked away. Richard had taken over Morrison Tech permanently, using power of attorney documents I'd signed before disappearing to what everyone assumed was an extended vacation. The mansion had been sold to a tech mogul who wanted the prestige of living in a billionaire's former home. Most of my assets had been transferred to a foundation that helped victims of financial crimes, keeping just enough to buy this island and live comfortably without attracting attention. The Bruce Morrison who'd built a $3 billion empire was gone. The man who remained was someone simpler, someone who measured wealth in sunsets instead of stock prices. I'd kept one thing from my old life. The Rolex my father had given me, the watch that had survived sharks and salt water and everything Derek and Amber had thrown at me. It sat on my wrist now as I watched fishing boats appear on the horizon, local men heading out for their daily catch. My phone buzzed with a message from Richard. He sent updates once a week, keeping me informed about the business and the ongoing legal proceedings related to Derek and Amber's other victims. Amber filed for appeal. Lawyers say she has no case, but she's going through the motions. Derek tried to hang himself in his cell last week. Guards found him in time. Thought you should know. R. I deleted the message without replying. Derek and Amber belonged to my past, and I'd learned not to look backward. A sound made me turn toward the water. Maria Gonzalez was walking up from the dock, carrying a basket of fruit from her boat. She was the widow of the fisherman who brought my supplies, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and hands weathered by decades of honest work. "Good morning, David," she said, using the name I'd given her when I'd first arrived on the island. She didn't know about Bruce Morrison, the tech billionaire, the man who'd been murdered and resurrected. To her, I was just David, a quiet American who paid well for privacy and helped her grandchildren with their English lessons when she brought them to visit. "Morning, Maria. How's the family?" "Good, good. Miguel caught a huge grouper yesterday. Carmen's baby is walking now. Life continues, you know." I smiled, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Contentment. Not the frantic happiness that came from closing a business deal or buying something expensive, but the quiet satisfaction of belonging somewhere without having to prove anything to anyone. Maria studied my face with the perceptive eyes of a woman who'd raised 8 children and buried a husband. "You look different today," she said. "Lighter." She was right. For months I'd been carrying the weight of what Derek and Amber had done to me, the burden of betrayal and the exhaustion of seeking justice, but somewhere between the sunrise and Maria's simple observation about life continuing, I'd let that weight go. Derek and Amber had stolen 20 years of my life through deception. I refused to let them steal whatever years I had left through bitterness. "I feel different," I admitted. "Like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." Maria nodded with the wisdom of someone who understood that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about choosing not to let it define your future. After she left, I walked to the other side of the island, to the small memorial I'd built from driftwood and stones. It wasn't a grave exactly, but a marker for the man I used to be. Bruce Morrison, tech entrepreneur, devoted husband, trusting fool. He'd died in the Pacific Ocean, pushed overboard by the woman he'd loved and left to drown by the man who'd planned his murder. But his death had given birth to someone else. Someone who understood that the most valuable things in life couldn't be stolen because they couldn't be bought in the first place. Trust had to be earned. Love had to be real. Peace had to be chosen. I'd learned all three lessons the hard way, but I'd learned them completely. As the sun reached its peak and the Caribbean stretched endlessly blue in all directions, I made a decision that would have surprised everyone who'd known the old Bruce Morrison. I was never going back. Not to Morrison Tech, not to Malibu, not to the world where money mattered more than honesty and success was measured by the size of your bank account rather than the quality of your character. The man who'd been pushed off that yacht had been worth $3 billion and had been utterly alone. The man standing on this beach was worth maybe $3 million and had found something infinitely more valuable. He'd found himself. My phone buzzed one more time, another message from Richard, probably with more updates about appeals and legal proceedings and all the machinery of justice grinding forward without me. I turned off the phone and threw it into the waves. Bruce Morrison was dead. David, the quiet American who helped children with their English and watched sunrises from a Caribbean beach, was very much alive. And for the first time in 20 years, I was exactly where I wanted to be, with exactly the life I'd chosen for myself. The sharks hadn't killed me. The betrayal hadn't broken me. The trial hadn't defined me. I'd survived it all, and in surviving, I'd learned the most important lesson of my life. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what really matters, and what really matters can never be taken away.